Hi, my name's Mike Oomens. I'm a senior film teacher here in Adelaide and I'm also a member of the Adam SA Executive. And today I'll be presenting to you on filmmaking for the classroom. So let's go. So I wanted to begin today by taking a little look at an overview of what I teach in the first weeks, really first term and a half of a Year 10 film studies course. So I'm going to show you a few bits and pieces from my planning, which will include theory work and practical work, but we'll also look at some of the tasks in detail and offer some tips as we go along in terms of how I get the students to produce that work. For a little bit of context, you should know that I see my Year 10s 3 times a week. Once for a double, which is 80 minutes, and 2 single lessons of 40 minutes. So I use the double lesson for practical work, and as you'll see, I use the single lessons to do some theory work. And I'd also just want to point out that whilst this is aimed at Year 10 students, you could easily adapt a lot of what I'm going to show you here for use at younger year levels, or as an introduction at Year 11 as students maybe begin a course at Year 11. Anyway, let's get into it and look at an overview of my theory work to begin with. What you see here is a little bit of a screenshot of my theory, and as it says there, there's 2 by 40-minute lessons each week. And in the first 7 weeks, I try and cover as much ground as I possibly can. So in the first week, I look at shot size, and when I'm looking at shot size, we basically look at six key shot sizes: the extreme long shot, the long shot, the full shot, the medium shot, the close-up, and the extreme close-up. We then move on to shot angles, and when we're looking at shot angles or camera angles, we look at the bird's eye view or the overhead shot. We look at high angle shots, eye level shots, and I always try and reinforce that most of the filmmaking we do is shot at eye level, the low angle shot, and a canted angle shot. From there we move into camera movement, and we look at movement in the horizontal and vertical planes, and we look at tilts and pans, we look at dolly and tracking shots, we look at the use of gimbals and crane shots and stabilizers, and we also look at the use of aerial shots, particularly from drones, because they seem to have become a fairly popular cinematic device in a lot of Netflix series and documentaries. We also look at handheld shots as well, and we just take a look at when and where to use those as we move through. I then move on to an overview of editing and introduce students to the concept of editing, and that it's basically the syntax of cinema, before we discuss continuity editing in a bit more detail and start to work on montage. And there's usually, all of these lessons are usually accompanied by a little exercise at the end that asks them to look at a class film and find evidence of a sequence of continuity, or find evidence of a montage sequence, or they might be asked to take still shots from the class film as examples of the various shot types that we've discussed. We finish off with editing by looking at transitions, simple cuts, jump cuts, fade downs, fade ups, dissolves, and wipes. And then we move into the world of sound, where we cover off on diegetic and non-diegetic sound. We look at sound effects in film. We look at music in film, which includes some excellent stuff from films like Apocalypse Now. And we look at spoken word, so we look at dialogue and voiceovers and things like that in a film. And then we explore how the sound, all this goes into building a film scene and how you can use sound to help build a film scene. And then we finish off by looking at lighting, and we start to look at classic three-point lighting keys, and we also look at symbolic lighting, the use of natural light, looking at lighting characters from below, the use of silhouettes, lighting characters from above, and lighting characters from behind. And often I'll combine that lesson with practical work using, a simple LED lighting rig. And the final thing is we look a little bit about the aesthetics of black and white and colour film. So essentially by midway, just over midway through first term, what I've tried to do is give students a good, strong theoretical grounding in the world of film language. So let's take a look then, now that we've put the theory to one side, let's take a look at what I do in terms of practical filmmaking, and I'll begin by a little bit of an overview of the tasks I do. So you can see here that there's a few tasks that I've listed. These aren't the only tasks that we do throughout the year, but these are my main introductory tasks. We start with one called the laundry list, which I'll go into detail. Then I run two tasks at the same time. One is an individual task, the film it task, and one is a group task, which is called Macho Walk. And then we move into the reverse engineer task, which is the third, or the second group task, but the third stage of my introduction to filmmaking work. So the laundry list task is an introductory filmmaking project, and the idea of it is to just get students familiar with some basic equipment. And I guess this is where my first key tip comes into play, because a lot of students at my school at least get caught up with what kind of kit they should be using. And the reality is we shoot all of our films in class on iPhones. And we use iMovie, and that sort of surprises a few people, but the reality is that these days more and more filmmakers are using mobile filmmaking kits, so that's one of the key reasons why I've gone down that route rather than using cameras or more traditional cameras. The other thing is, I really want to encourage students to understand that the world of filmmaking is in their pocket, and they can, pull out their phone, and if they've got a few tricks up their sleeve, they can make some pretty engaging videos. So yeah, we use iPhones and iMovie, and we obviously use school-supplied iPhones because we want to control the images that the students are taking. We don't let them use their personal iPhones, and obviously our students have access to Macs with iMovie on it. The other reason, of course, we use iMovie is that as the students progress through year 11 and 12, by that stage often they've graduated to using Final Cut Pro, and you can just simply export an iMovie file into Final Cut Pro to do editing in that system. I'm not overly concerned when I'm teaching editing about which system students use. Some students prefer to use Premiere, other students use iMovie, other students want to use Final Cut. I'm more interested in helping students tell a story, and most of the video editing software available now has the basic same interface. There's a timeline, an input screen and an output screen. So I don't get too fussed about the technology side of things, which really frees me up to talk to students about what story they're trying to tell and how they're going to tell it. So anyway, back to laundry list. It's a really simple project, and we take the shot sizes and the camera angles that are in the first two lessons that I teach in the theory part of the course, and I just ask the students to film a very brief example of each shot. So each shot should last about 5 seconds, and they cut those together and label each shot as they go. Some students use intertitles, some students use titles as overlays, but they just have to make a very simple film, 5 seconds per shot. The film itself goes for about 60 seconds altogether. And they make a very simple film. And what that does is it gets them used to framing, using their phones to frame shots. It gets them used to getting the footage off their phones and onto their laptops. They then import that into iMovie, gets them used to the workflow of importing, gets them used to cutting, or introduces them to the concept of cutting bits of film together. And then, of course, adding titles and spitting it out at the other end in terms of an exported film file. So at the end of the project, the students create a 1-minute film demonstrating the selected terms properly labelled, and as you can see there, they gain familiarity with the equipment, practice each stage of film creation, shooting, capturing, editing, and rendering, reinforce cinematic vocabulary, and the key skills that I make sure we cover off on are basic camera operation, basic capturing and editing techniques, and basic titling techniques. And that feeds into a couple of assessments. My students work on a portfolio over the course of 2 terms and produce a written reflection. But it also helps them start to understand how various shots influence the meaning that we see in film. The next practical task is another individual task, so students do both the laundry list and the film it tasks on their own. This one comes from the Australian Centre for the Moving Image in Melbourne. It's on their website, and I'll include a link on the screen for you so that you can see it, so that you can access it. It's quite a cool little task. The students are given some folders with footage and sounds in it, and they edit together a version of a very simple, short little film. It's an introductory editing project, and it allows them to gain some familiarity with their chosen software, as well as some basic terminology involved in editing, and using the footage provided by Acme, they edit together a little film. They go through the various stages of producing that film, and this is all part of the resource that Acme has. They guide you through it. So it's a really good resource for you to use. So they complete a rough cut, a fine cut, they add music, they mess with the film by adding quick cuts, so they play with pacing, add some jump cuts, and they look at condensing time, and then they also work with inserts, cutting on action, and L&J cuts. All of which is explained through handy little videos that are part of the resource from Acme. So if a lot of that doesn't make sense to you, it will once you watch the little videos, and you can either ask the students to watch them in their own time or watch them as a class. So my students complete this task on their own outside of class time, and I've found that it's a really good means of starting to talk about editing. And it's also a really good opportunity for me to start discussing with students folder structure in terms of editing and getting them organising their footage and their various files that they use to edit, getting them organised from day one so that you don't end up with a film lab full of computers with files all over the desktop, just getting them into good habits. And this folder structure is also available as a short video on YouTube, and you'll see the link to that on your screen. So that's the Film It task. It's a cool little task, and again, really worth running, and it follows on nicely from the very, very basic skills that students have developed whilst completing the laundry list task. The next task that I get students to complete is one that's called Macho Walk. I didn't title it that, it's just the name that it was given. It's from the book that you can see on your screen now, Making Short Films. It's a really interesting little task because it starts to get the students to take some of the skills that they've developed in the first two practical tasks and start to mess with the idea of short, simple narratives. I run this at the same time as the students are running the film it task as individuals. It just helps fill in any dead time. So if a student is sort of twiddling their thumbs while someone's off writing a shot list or shooting something, or the editor's working, it just keeps the kids busy. But this is a really cool little task, and essentially all it is telling the story of two people bumping into each other. Now, the original task is called Macho Walk because it originally asked for two people to walk towards each other. Clearly they're going to bump into each other, but neither one of them wants to give way. So they hold a line and have this sort of stare off as they're walking towards each other, and then comically bump into each other and fall over. I've changed that over the years. I don't tell kids to make that film. I let them make any kind of version of bumping into each other that they want. So I've had people bumping into each other around corners, people bumping into each other by trying to enter a doorway at the same time. Some people just bumping into each other in terms of, saying hi, bumping into each other at random. So even the concept of bumping into each other has sort of changed and evolved over time. This year I've got students telling the story of a student wagging school and ordering Uber Eats, and the student's mum bumps into the Uber driver at the front door. So, even the key protagonist isn't the one doing the bumping. The other thing that this task asks students to do is start to use the key elements of a film scene. So this is something that Piper talks about in the book, Making Short Films, but these are the key elements of shooting a film scene, and that involves master shots, follow-up shots, which are obviously all the shots that follow up your establishing shot, your close-ups, your medium shots, all those kind of things. Cross-cutting sequences, so that can either be a dialogue sequence or it can be, two pieces of action happening at different locations at the same time. So in this case, parallel editing of the two individuals moving towards each other. Cut-ins, which might be things like close-ups of watches showing the time, or important details that the audience needs. A POV sequence, so moving the camera so it looks as if we're seeing something through the character's eyes. Match cutting, so making sure we're cutting on action, eyeline matches, those kind of things, and cutaways to show some colour on the sides of the action. So maybe reaction shots of people watching, or cutting away to important details outside the central narrative action. Of course, as the students move through the task, they start to see that one shot might fulfill more than one function. So one shot might act as a follow-up shot, a cut-in and a POV. For example, someone looking at their watch might serve all of those three functions. So they start to realise that the camera can often be doing more than one thing at a time. So they create a simple 1-minute film, which is another thing that students often think they're going to come in and make feature films, but I tend to keep all of my films to 1 to 2 minutes for students. That's plenty of time for them, and it also it makes them focus on really good, tight narrative storytelling. So again, it's just reinforcing familiarity with equipment, practicing the stages of film creation, reinforcing their vocabulary. Some basic camera operation techniques and capturing and editing techniques are reinforced as well. It's also the point at which we start to look at things like shot lists. So actually starting to write down the shots that you need. We look at creating simple shooting schedules. So teaching students that you don't just follow the shot list from shot 1 to shot 32, that you might take all of the shots in one location at one time, and you'll move locations and take all the shots as your secondary location rather than chopping and changing between the two. And it's surprising how many students think that you take one shot at one location, move, take shot 2, move, take shot 3. And if you look at some of the other videos in this series, there's some really good information there about some of that documentation and some of those on-set practices. And we also start to do things like location scouts, looking at, where the power sources are, what's the light doing. Students are starting to consider things like, if I'm shooting in the last 2 lessons of the day, where's the sun going to be? All of those things start to come into play in their discussions as we move through the task. And then also we start to log our shots. So when we're out on location, we start trying to track the good shots and the bad shots, and just getting in the practice of, at the end of each lesson, bringing in that day's footage and capturing it, making sure that it's secured, and then allowing the editor to go away and take a look at it and feedback to the group about the quality of the work that they've produced over the course of that day, so that they're prepared for any pickup shots that they might need to do. So the next task that we look at is something that I call reverse engineer, and it's a fairly common task used in film schools elsewhere, but it's simply reinforcing or I guess proving what I'm trying to get students to understand in the macho walk task, which is the elements of film language that go into making a scene. That is the master shots, follow-up shots, cut-ins, cutaways, cross-cutting, max cutting, and POV sequences. So essentially what students do is they choose a famous piece of film, a minute or so, maybe 2 minutes of cinema. They can either choose themselves, or you could give them a list of films to choose from. So you might choose the classic sequences for them to reverse engineer. But basically what they do is they deconstruct that 1 to 2 minute piece and try and recreate it shot for shot to produce a short little film of their own. Now, for some fun, what I tend to do is ask them to change the context of the film from the original to a school setting. It also just makes it a little bit easier to shoot during class time, because you're not having to deal so much with costumes and those kind of things. But we've had teachers play Darth Vader, we've had a principal play The Godfather, we've had all sorts of reverse engineers done. We've had teachers recreate the staircase scene from Streetcar Named Desire, all sorts of things. So it really is up to the imagination. So the students have a lot of fun. It's a great chance for them to also get around to some of their favourite teachers or other teachers and have a bit of fun. I tend to find other staff members are quite flattered when they're asked to be in a student film, and it also helps just get the program out there amongst the other teachers. It helps the staff feel like they're part of the film program. So yeah, the reverse engineer is really quite simple. So they start by analysing the scene, they break it down shot for shot. So they basically reconstruct a shot list from the original piece of film. Then they again write their shooting schedule and head out and shoot it. And once they've developed their little story, once they've transformed it from the original to a school setting, they can really have some fun with it. And really the idea of the reverse engineer is to prove what we've spoken about. So they tend to see that, all of the things that I just did in my own Macho Walk film are also being done by professional filmmakers out on location. So really simple task, but a nice one, and it kind of rounds off my introduction to filmmaking tasks. Now what usually happens is once we've developed all of that, I spend a little bit of time with the students making little 1-minute films for entry into the ADAM 1-minute film competition. But that's not what I wanted to talk to you about right now. What I wanted to talk to you about is another task, which is kind of the final task that I'll talk about today, and it's a genre filmmaking task, and it's really handy to use if you are studying film genre. Essentially, the task involves me showing examples of a jump scare sequence, a chase sequence, and a high noon shootout. And we start to look at what are the genre conventions at work and how do those genre conventions influence what's happening on the screen. So how do they influence how the camera frames a shot, how the camera moves, how does it influence the pacing of the edit, does it influence transitions, what do we start to see in terms of mise-en-scène, so we start to talk about what we see inside the frame, costuming elements, those kind of things. And essentially, the students go away and recreate one of those three genre modes, I guess. So they recreate a jump scare, or they recreate a chase sequence, or they recreate a high noon shootout. Now, when I say recreate, they actually make up their own. So the jump scare doesn't necessarily have to be a horror jump scare. We've had students doing jump scares where, they've been late for school and the deputy head has caught them in the corridor, or they've been caught on their phone, or something like that they use to create the scare. Chase sequences, we've had kids, chasing someone who's nicked their lunch, or, even just pointless chases where students have, run through various doorways and things like that. But again, it's just trying to get that immediacy and pacing of a chase correct. And obviously a high noon shootout is some sort of face-off situation where two students are facing off over something, and we've had students facing each other off over the last sausage roll in the canteen, or the last textbook on a shelf in the library, those kind of things. So that's the last task that I would recommend to teachers that are looking to do a film production cycle. And if you were actually to do the laundry list, film it, Macho Walk, the reverse engineer, and the genre task, you could actually fill a couple of terms. So particularly if you're stuck teaching a course just over a semester, maybe 2 terms, as I know that some schools do, that could easily fill out a nice little couple of units. Or if you're teaching your media or film course as part of a larger course, then certainly you could fit in other stuff around it. If you were doing things like podcasting or web design or those kind of things, you could fit in those tasks around those other media disciplines. So nice, really simple task is the genre film task as well. So I hope that was a useful session for you. Fairly quick run through of the tasks that I cover in the first couple of terms of work with my Year 10 film class. If you have any questions or any thoughts on what you've seen here in this session, please don't hesitate to contact me via either the ADAM SA Facebook page or via our website. I'd be more than happy to take the time to catch up with anyone that has further questions, and hopefully we'll get to see you at a face-to-face ADAM SA session in the near future. Thank you.